Last few weeks we've been looking at the good news that Jesus of Nazareth, crucified and risen, is Lord. And we've been unpacking the implications of what that means. Last week we looked at what it means in my notion of power. And this week I want to look at what Jesus Christ, crucified and risen as Lord, means for my identity. So, Jesus gives us a new family, a new story, and a new way to value ourselves. First, a new family. So blood is thicker than water, we say. We all know in every culture that our ties to our family are greater and our obligations are more solemn than they are to other people. This is especially true in other cultures more than our own, but even then we still understand that we have obligations to our parents, to our children, to our siblings. And so it's a bit difficult for us sometimes to register Jesus' claim of lordship because that claim can come in opposition to the demands of our family. In Jesus' time, this was especially true because Christianity was a fringe thing in the early days. Following Jesus was not something that was socially acceptable. And because their culture had a very strongly developed sense of requiring to follow your family. So if your family said to follow Jesus, and then you felt like you had an obligation or to not follow Jesus if the family said not to follow him. And so Jesus gets around this by reconfiguring people's understanding of what family even means. Jesus offers the scandalous suggestion that when we become his followers, our relationship with other believers becomes a family relationship. And so we meet those family obligations not by doing what our mothers or fathers or cousins or aunts or uncles tell us to do, but by following Jesus. And by exercising those relationships that we have, those obligations with other people. We see this in a story early on in Jesus' ministry. In Matthew 12, 46-50, it says, "As Jesus was speaking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside, asking to speak to him. Someone told Jesus, 'Your mother and brothers are standing outside, and they want to speak to you.' Jesus asked, 'Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?' Then he pointed at his disciples and said, 'Look, these are my mother and brothers. Anyone who does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother.'" So our identification with our Heavenly Father is more important even than our identification with our earthly father. Now, of course, ancient Israel, with its strongly developed sense of family obligation, this is really big. But I think it's important to us, even though we have a less developed sense of obligation to our family, than it's just as big for us as it was for Israel. And that's because of our life in a globalized world. So, we are meant to love our neighbors. Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan is a story about how we have obligations to love people around us, our neighbors. But our neighbors are not necessarily the people who are like us, not necessarily our family. Our neighbors are anybody that we come into contact with, as the Samaritan who came into contact with the poor man lying half dead at the side of the road. And in an interconnected world, there's a whole lot more neighbors. For Jesus, love isn't an abstraction. Love is a concrete thing that you do. And so you can't love an abstraction. And that's why Jesus says that our obligation is to love our neighbor. I can't love a person whom I've never met and don't even know exists, not in any sort of concrete way. But because we live in an interconnected reality, I have the obligation, or I have the opportunity to love many, many neighbors. People from all over the world. As we've seen, members of this church have been to Cuba and practiced God's love for their brothers and sisters in Cuba. And now I would say that that's an opportunity that most Christians would not have had not all that long ago. And so our interconnected world means that we have greater possibility to connect with more people who call themselves Christians. And this means that we have those family obligations to more and more people. Now, as people in the richer part of the world, we can look at that as a net negative. Oh, more people that we have to support financially. But that seems to suggest that our family relationships are primarily about material relationships. And yes, of course, as a parent, I provide materially for my children, but that's not the total dimension of those relationships, is it? As family members, we encourage one another. We love one another. We serve one another. We correct one another. And in the same way, as a global family of Christians, we have the opportunity to serve and be served by other Christians in lots of different ways. So yes, if we have more than we need, then we are able to share with those who have less than they need. But it goes far beyond that. We can pray for one another. We can encourage one another. We can offer correction to one another. Goodness knows we all have cultural blind spots. And those things can seem glaringly obvious to others, who, if they offer them in love, do us a service, even if it doesn't always feel like it's a service at the time. And so, by coming into this new family, we have a whole bunch of people whom we have an opportunity to serve and who can serve us and correct us and help us grow. Also, by coming into this new family, we find ourselves rubbing shoulders with the kinds of people that we aren't necessarily always comfortable with. In Jesus' day, that was Jews and Gentiles. Jews often looked down on Gentiles as godless pagans, and Gentiles looked down on Jews as morally smug. And so when Jesus brought these two people together, there were some sparks that flew. And yet, he calls us together to be one family in spite of how difficult sometimes those relationships can be. Writing to the Ephesians, Paul says, "But you," and he's speaking of to Gentiles at that point, "have been united with Christ Jesus. Once you were far away from God, but now you've been brought near to him through the blood of Christ. For Christ himself has brought us, Jews and Gentiles, peace to us. He united Jews and Gentiles into one people when in his body on the cross he broke down the wall of hostility that separated us. He did this by ending the system of its laws and commandments and regulations. And he made peace between Jews and Gentiles by creating in himself one new people from the two groups." In our time, Jesus calls us to cross the boundaries that keep us separate from other people. It's not always a Jew-Gentile distinction. But there are boundaries in our own sense of comfort. Who are the kinds of people that we struggle to be comfortable to call family? Those boundaries could be racial, gender, political, theological, sociological. But yet, he calls us to cross them. That out of many groups of people who only have one common characteristic, their allegiance to Jesus, he forms one new group of people. And because he brings us together from such a diverse collection of peoples, we have an opportunity to learn to love, even when love isn't easy. And I think that might simply be the most valuable lesson that we have in learning to love others. So Jesus gives us a new family. Jesus also gives us a new story. Our past shapes our future. My grandmother was a war bride. She married my grandfather, a serviceman serving in the Canadian Army in England during the Second World War. My father-in-law was an immigrant who came from the Netherlands to Canada when he was a young man. Both my grandmother and my father-in-law carried that part of their identity with them for the rest of their lives. Who they have been shapes who they are in the present and who they will be in the future. And that's fine, except that there are parts about our past that we'd rather not carry into our present and into our future, because we all carry with us the stain of Adam, so to speak. A few months ago, I preached about the image of God and how sin comes into the world. And I talked about how Adam's story is powerful because it is all of our stories. Adam and Eve were created by God to live in relationship with him in this blessed place, but by choosing to grasp that fruit from the tree of the garden, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they decided for themselves what is right and wrong, rather than allowing God to do it for them. And so they declared themselves to be gods. And that is what we do every time we choose to go our own way rather than God's way. We fail, and we contribute to the brokenness and the fallenness of this world. We invariably choose what seems right to us by what is in our own interests. And so, we have this part of our story that seems to suggest that we will always be broken. And yet, God invites us out of our story and into a new story, where we can leave behind the story of our past and take up a new way of being in the world. We have been given a divine do-over. Writing to the Philippians, Paul tells the believers there that they should behave like Jesus, who, as he already existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant, and being born in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Now, I used the NASB translation here, which is not one I typically preach from, because it actually preserves the wording from the original language. Most modern translations have changed this to say something like, he did not consider equality with God something to be used to his advantage, which in the broad sense is what Paul is arguing. But the wording that Paul chooses here is meant to convey an implicit comparison. It's not out in the open, but he is actually comparing Adam and Jesus here. The picture, of course, is of Adam grasping for fruit. Now, of course, Eve kind of grasped the fruit, but Paul sort of conflates the two of them into one person and sort of calls it all Adam. But we might look at it in the way that I have here on this diagram. Basically, Adam here over on the left. And he is human, but he is grasping after divine when he and Eve take hold of that fruit. They are basically saying, I want the ability to call my own shots. I want to be divine. And then we have Jesus. Jesus is divine, but he empties himself of that divinity, taking on the form of humanity. Not just any human, he becomes the lowest human. And so, Adam's story is all of our story. We are all humans, disobediently grasping after divinity. And Jesus is the divine one, emptying himself of divinity to take on humanity. And Jesus calls us from the Adam story into his story. He transforms us to live a new kind of life. Rather than being mere humans trying to make much of ourselves, trying to make ourselves into gods, he says you can be a dearly adopted child of God who expresses that exaltation by emptying yourself in loving service to other people. You see, if Jesus is Lord, then Jesus becomes our yardstick for understanding what glory is. And so we have to say, what is glory? Glory is whatever Jesus is. Glory is whatever Jesus does. And if Jesus, his life is characterized by emptying himself of power and privilege, then that must be the expression of glory. And so God invites us to no longer be the kind of people who are striving after making ourselves gods, but who accept that we are adopted children of God, and who can then pour out ourselves in the security that that place gives us for the sake of other people. Our lives no longer become a part of the problem, but they become a healing balm for this world as our lives reflect the glorious self-sacrificial love of Jesus. And so our past failures don't need to dictate our future. So God gives us a new story. He says, why don't you stop being Adam and be like Jesus instead? So he gives us a new family and a new story, but he also gives us a new way of valuing ourselves and others. We often evaluate ourselves and people based on what we do, professionally, but also in a volunteer sense. So we say that a person who's a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer is more valuable than a person who's, say, a retail clerk. Well, that's how the world values people anyways. But we often then avoid doing certain things that will then move us down in people's eyes. Because our self-worth is tied up in what we do, there are certain things we can't do without diminishing ourselves. A few years ago, I met a new Canadian who had been a refugee in Africa. He'd been a high government official who'd enjoyed lots of power and privilege and position, but had run afoul of the government and had to flee for his life. Eventually, he and his family were settled in Canada by the local ministerial group that took them under their wings and sponsored their immigration papers and everything. Now, he came over in the winter, He had nothing, no job, nothing at all. He's totally dependent on other people. But when it came springtime, his lawn got long. And he asked, what should I do about that? And they said, well, you can mow your lawn. To which he was like, no way am I mowing my lawn. That work is beneath me. He'd spent his whole life understanding himself to be at a certain level. And the idea that if he mowed his lawn, he would somehow degrade himself meant that he was totally unwilling to do something that most men in our culture sort of take for granted as just something you do that has no bearing on your identity or value. But his identity and value was tied up in what he did or did not do. Now we can see the difference there. We can see what he does as sort of silly because we have some cultural distance from it. But we behave often the same way in churches. In churches, people tend to volunteer in ways that get them recognition and visibility. So if we had a larger church and there was a much wider array of possibilities for people to volunteer, what you find is that you have more people volunteering for things like the worship team or being a prayer leader or something like that up front than you have people doing building maintenance or people cleaning or doing nursery or Sunday school. Because certain things are more visible, certain things get more recognition. What we're saying is that what we do defines our value, and so we strive to make ourselves more valuable. But Jesus deconstructs all of this. Jesus of Nazareth is a peasant. He is also Lord. Can I reconcile in my vision of what his lordship is with his low social status? And we don't see for sure what Jesus did for a living before he was a preacher, but it seems most likely that he was a carpenter because his father was a carpenter at a time in culture where you typically did what dad did. And so Jesus worked with his hands. Can I reconcile my idea of this glorious Lord with a person who works with his hands? We can't say that Jesus is Lord and that he has all the glory that comes with being a Lord, the Lord, unless we are able to reconcile his life with our vision of value and glory. As if to hammer the point home, we see the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. In John's telling of the Last Supper, he sets it up by saying that Jesus knew that he'd come from the Father, that he was going back to the Father, and the Father had put all things under his authority. It's as if to say that Jesus has a profound sense of security in who he is and his own importance. And it is out of his own sense of importance that he gets down and washes his disciples' feet. Work that is reserved for the lowest slave in a household. What Jesus does is scandalous because in his own culture, he is demeaning himself. And so he's challenging the way that that culture thinks about importance. When he comes to Peter, Peter's like, no way am I going to let you wash my feet. Peter's speaking for all the disciples probably. He's just the guy who says what everybody else is thinking. And what now Peter is concerned. He wants Jesus to have status, to have glory. And that's all well and good. It's just he has a mistaken understanding of what is glorious. Jesus defines for us what is glorious. And so, Jesus basically tells him, well, you don't understand what glory means. When he's finished washing all of the disciples' feet, he says, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so. That's what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And so Jesus shows us that importance doesn't come from doing what is seen as important. Importance comes through loving service. And if we take this to heart, how does it change our lives? Does it change what we're willing to do for God? If I felt like God called me to a lower paying or less prestigious job, would I take it? Or would I protest that it would somehow diminish me? If God asked me to serve in church in a way that doesn't get any recognition, that seems thankless, Would I do it, or would I hold out for something that gave me greater status in people's eyes? If God asked me to spend time with the kinds of people that the world says are no good, the kinds of people that the world says aren't worth your time, would I do so? And would I do so humbly, seeing them as my brothers and sisters, or would I do so with a sense of condescension, like, aren't I pious for spending my time with you? If we understand that importance is derived from our loving service of other people, then it changes how we behave if we really take that idea to heart. So in conclusion, if Jesus Christ, crucified and risen, is Lord, he has a lot to say about who I am. He invites me into a new family, one that includes all kinds of people, and through which he gives me an opportunity to love and be loved, to support and be supported, to pray for and to be prayed for, to give generously to and to receive graciously from. He invites me into a new story where my past failures do not have to define my present and my future. Through the cross, he reconciles us to God and allows us to be reconciled to one another. He gives us a new way of valuing ourselves based on, he gives us a new way of evaluating ourselves as God's beloved children, bought at a great price, and gives us security then to serve one another in ways that seem unremarkable and ordinary, knowing that it is in our unremarkable and ordinary service that we find approval in his eyes. We live in a broken world, and as products of that broken world, we share in its brokenness. But the Christian faith says that God is going to make all things new. All things will be made right. And the first fruit of that movement is a group of people he has called together, the church. He has given us the opportunity to be adopted as his children and empowered by his Spirit to be transformed into new creation. As God is remaking creation into something new and beautiful, we are the first part of it. And that is good news.